dreams are in some way a kind of, well, maybe their own sort of mockery of reality, not necessarily a mockery of reality, but they're a consciousness on a certain level. And that the real world, the waking world, the world that we think is real, is itself a dream. It's a much more solid and fleshed out. It's a much more vigorous dream. What Einstein called, Einstein said that reality basically is a hallucination, but a very persistent one. Okay, it's this persistent hallucination so we've got this dream, but he said that one of the things arguing that occult techniques is trying to one of the whole things of enlightenment. Okay, the concept is that the goal, the study and practice of any kind of occult doctrine, call it religious or otherwise, is to attain enlightenment. It's to attain some sort of expanded sense of reality. And the person who was telling me this goes, what that is simply waking up within your living day-to-day dream. That is, waking up and realizing that, just as in the other dream, that it's not completely real and that you're aware of what's going on, and then you can begin to change it. That's when you can create change in conformity with will, because reality is manipulable. Once you wake up in it, that you can then change it. You can't necessarily change everything, but you can begin to affect it in different ways, in the same way that if you woke up in a dream. And I think that makes a certain amount of sense. Not that you can, now I'm not arguing you can really do that, but I'm just saying that people will believe that they can. And it's a way of sort of looking at the whole sort of, if you sometimes wonder, what's the goal of occult or magical enlightenment? Well, that's the goal. The goal is to wake up.
Hi guys, so I'm back here with Rick Spence, and it's a great pleasure to be able to speak with Rick again. I really enjoyed our last conversation, and I'm going to be speaking about Secrets of the Occult, his series that he has up on Amazon. Fantastic series. As I was saying to him just before we started, I've got another 3 or 4 episodes to go before I finished it. But it's a fantastic series, and you will see links to it in the description of the video. So Rick, it's very good, as I said, and you cover a broad range of subjects related to the occult in the series. And I guess what I'm picking up from it now is your emphasis on intent more than anything. You really emphasize the intention of somebody. Intent. It's not really a question of good versus evil, I think, but what's the individual's intent? What importance do you give an individual's intent in terms of the occult?
Well, intention. Well, I think it spreads beyond anything that has to do with an occult application. That's just what you deal with when you're dealing with people in everyday life. Anytime we meet someone, especially when we don't know them that well and we're engaging in, what do they want? Okay. And the thing is that people can be, I mean, most of the time, most people are fairly open about what their intention is, but they can be devious. They can disguise that. The intention can be very different in terms of what's actually put forward. So intent is always important in any type of interaction you have. So when its application to the occult, basically, when we explain more of this, is that a lot of sort of occult practice is, or what maybe more to the proper term here is magical practice, is making things happen the way that you want them to. Now, we may get more into explaining what it is that I mean by that, but it's to sort of turn reality in the direction you want it to go. And that's where the intention of what you want becomes that's what's guiding the entire thing. And those intentions can be, well, it could be an intention as simple as much as you want to get rich. I want to attract money and wealth and fame and all of these things. Or the intention could be to kill someone. Okay. But that would be where the whole sort of will that comes in. Now, you go back. I knew we wouldn't be talking about this 5 minutes, and I'd mention Aleister Crowley because he's going to come up. And if you haven't, as you may already have noticed, Aleister Crowley gets mentioned in every single episode of Secrets of the Occult. I didn't start out planning it that way. It's just that he kind of inevitably comes up because he's always this kind of modern reference point. So go back to, or maybe to start with, Aleister Crowley's definition of magic. And that is, as I think I'm paraphrasing him, but I think I've got it pretty much correct. I paraphrased it enough. Is that magic is the art and science of causing change to occur in conformity with will being intent in that case. So again, it's just basically trying to figure out what people actually want. What are they trying to get out of this? What's their aim? For instance, let's say you go to a car lot. Okay, you want to buy a car, and you have to deal with a car salesman. Now when you go in there what the intent of the car salesman is. It's to sell you a car, and also to sell you a car in which he can make as much commission as possible. And he wants to sell you that car and get you to pay as much for it as he can. Now, your intention is something quite different. You want to buy a car, but you want to pay as little for it as you can. And so there's this whole, but you maintain a kind of friendly dialogue which is going on. And and one of the things you'll find is that car salesmen almost always are extremely friendly. Okay, they're like the best friend that you never knew you had, and that's going to last during the whole sort of negotiations. But that's all part of the it's all part of the plan. He has to be friendly and to get you to agree to his intention, which is to get you to pay as much as you possibly were willing to do for the car. So, I mean, it's a very simplistic, maybe, example, but it shows where intention is in everything. When we get into, like flirting in bars, well, everybody knows what everybody's intention is there, but you also have to disguise that generally in some way. But see, that's where you're trying to figure it out. You're talking up a girl in the bar. Was she interested? What sort of signs do you have? How do you interpret? Is she playing hard to get? Is she just doesn't like me? What are her intentions as opposed to what mine might be? So yeah, intention is important.
Do you think there's a such thing as good and evil? Is intent separate from good and evil? For example, a jihadist who is about to behead somebody, his intention is to be closer to God. So in his world, he's actually doing something that's positive and good, but objectively, it's an evil act. So do you think intention and evil and good are separate, or can they be linked?
Does do good and evil exist? Well, now there's a question for you. It would be, well, again, I'd say it comes down to the intention. And my take on it, for what it's worth, I'm no theologian, but I would say that someone who, one of the things about ideology, whether it's religious ideology or political ideology, is that once you start believing in things, once you believe in some sort of organized system, one of the things that allows you to do, not always, but very often, is to do really horrible things, but in the cause of what you believe to be a greater good. And sometimes, I mean, that's just kind of practical. Sometimes we have to do unpleasant things. I suppose you could, if you want to take it down to the simplest level, is that, killing things isn't necessarily fun. I guess it is for some people, but in the real world, where you can't go to the supermarket and get your organic food. That's what you have to do. That's what it requires. You have to kill animals and eat them in order to stay alive. Because from your standpoint, staying alive is the greater good. That's what it is you must do. Therefore, if you have to sacrifice something else's life to do that, maybe in the best of all possible worlds you wouldn't want to, but you don't really have that choice in that form. So you would have to do, well, I suppose from the standpoint of whatever it is that you're eating, what you're doing is a very evil thing. There's nothing good in that for them. But from your standpoint, it's simply a matter of necessity. And I guess that's one of the things you look at is something to me in a way can be judged as sort of good or evil on the positive negative scale as to whether it was necessary. Therefore, killing without necessity, killing simply for the joy of doing so, simply for that kind of experience, without any idea of eating the animal or do anything else, sort of useless slaughter, is different. It's the same action. You're doing exactly the same thing. That is, you're killing another creature. But in the one case, you're killing them to devour them, to keep yourself alive as a basic biological necessity. And the other one, you're just kind of doing it for the hell of it. Same action, but notice, we come back to this, what's the difference is the intention between those two things. And that sort of gets into the realm, I suppose, of malevolence. And so one of the things that I would sort of put into the evil column is not the action itself, but the motivation behind it. And the motivation, and what I mean by malevolence, is just doing something nasty to do something nasty and enjoying it. That is to inflict pain for the sheer joy of doing it, some kind of sadistic satisfaction that comes with it. And so there again, that's why intention, what it is you intend to do in that.
Is that black magic?
Huh?
Is that black magic when you do something just for the sake of doing it, an evil act?
Well, to get different descriptions, black magic can also be described as just getting what you want the quick and dirty way. That is, there's and again, it's true for many other things. You want to achieve an end. There can be two ways to do that. One can be a fairly long, complicated process that involves, well, not just time, but negotiation and compromise. And another is just, let's put it in fairly simple terms. You want something from someone. Well, you can either enter in a process of negotiation and make some sort of deal that's mutually acceptable to the two of you to get them to buy that car, or you can just go and take it from them, or you can kill them and take it from them. The whole idea is that you end up with possession of whatever it is you wanted, and there's a kind of long route to doing that, and there's a quick and dirty way of doing it. So one of the ways that I've heard black magic described is that it's the quick and dirty way of doing something. It's not necessarily maliciousness for the sake of maliciousness, but it can be in some ways. It's one of those things that if you go back and give any kind of credence to things like testimony in witch trials, okay, and that's pretty iffy. But you go back to the 17th century, let's say, and you look at these, and you'll often find that what people will confess to, that one of the things that's mentioned, that when witches would get together, when they would sort of meet and they would be assembled before their devil, their leader, and they would often be asked what it was that they had done since the last meeting, as really sort of a testimony of their devotion. And what they would be expected to do in many cases was not to talk about all the good things that they had done, but all the kind of wicked and mean things that they had done. I caused my neighbor's cows to abort all of their calves, and I caused the grain to rot and do all the variety, and their milk to curdle. Just to do nasty things to them, to torment them in those cases. So if any of that kind of evidence is to be believed, and that's a big question, but I don't think you can also just kind of throw it out with a dishwater, because these things tended to be repeated it's not just one person in one place who's saying it, is that there was, in those occasions, in those circumstances, a value placed upon people doing things that appeared to be purely malevolent. But the whole purpose in doing them was to cause trouble and pain and torment to either the community around you or particular targeted people. And that was the only thing that was there. It wasn't even a matter of revenge in some case. It was just trying to do nasty things. And that this in some way fit into this general idea of transgression. That what you deliberately do is that you violate norms and laws as a way of, again, maybe not so much of being just mean, but as a way of breaking out of a particular psychological realm that you're in. I'm not explaining this well. The concept of, in occultism, you can often find this idea of transgression, which involves people often doing terrible things like murder. But what would be one of the reasons why you would want to kill someone? Well, you don't like them. Okay, that could be it. You have some sort of beef with them. Or it could be simply an action the whole point of this action is to change you, the killer. By committing this action, you have broken a taboo. And by breaking that taboo, by doing this thing that would otherwise, with the whole society around you, be seen as reprehensible, terrible, and criminal, you have, from one viewpoint, you have kind of broken out of the mold. You have assumed you're no longer part of this whole sort of society around yourself. You have transcended that in some way. And there is an argument within some areas of occult practice or other practice that you need to do those things. You have to do this as a kind of almost spiritual growth on your part. You have to be willing to do things that you used to think that you would be afraid to transgress, but as a way of breaking free of that fear of in some way growing in other dimensions, you have to be able to break those rules. It's a slippery slope in a lot of ways.
It reminds me, there was a guy you mentioned in your series, Shabtai Zevi, I think he's the Jewish mystic,
Yeah.
and he had a branch of Jew. I think he started a branch of Judaism or of the Kabbalah. He got some of the Kabbalah, and it was all about transgression, about how to transgress. You had to do a certain amount of transgressions in order to instigate the Messiah that God will come. He was trying to act out some of the prophecies, I think.
Yeah, his name is pronounced in various ways. So you look at it, Shabtai Zevi sometimes, or Shabtai Zvi. I'll call him Shabtai Zvi because it's short, it's easier to say. So Shabtai Zevi, yeah, he was a fellow who in the 1600s, in what's now the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, the Near East, proclaimed himself the Messiah. And he believed that as the Messiah, one of the things that since he had showed up, that the old laws, that all of the Jewish laws, and there are lots of them, 600 of them, Okay, and change. All of these, this is all of these very things. You have to do this, and you have to do it in a certain way, and you can eat this, and you can't eat that, and you can't eat these things together. And if you mess up, you have to bury the plate in the back. Okay, there's just rules and rules and rules and rules and rules. And that's one of those things that provides a kind of structure to life. That's a good example. It does. It does. You get up every morning and you know that there's certain things you can do and you can't do, and you have to do them in a particular order. And so, while it gives a structure to your life, the other part of it is that it's also tiresome and oppressive because you have to do these things all the time without, and things that often just seem to be arbitrary. Okay. And, why are you doing this? Because because God says that you must. God never explains himself. Okay. He's not going to explain why you have to have, snaps instead of buttons. No, that's just it. That's the way these things are decreed. So it's one of those things you can either kind of take comfort in, and you can feel that it maps out your life for you, or it's one of those things that can be horribly, just tiresome and restrictive. And most of those currents are always running in everybody at the same time. They're just things that, you know, uh, let's say, it's the Sabbath and you're not supposed to be able to manipulate anything. Is that, wouldn't life be simpler that you wouldn't have to go out and hire a non-Jew to come in and turn everything on and off for you? I mean, is God really going to be upset if you just flip on and off the lights? Well, you're not supposed to. So it depends upon how serious you do that. So the laws are either a kind of blessing, but they're also a kind of curse in a certain way. So Shabtai Zevi said was that, well, I'm the Messiah, I'm okay, and it's a new dispensation. So once I've gotten here, all these old laws don't mean anything. And we need to usher in a kind of change. And one of the ways that you will do that, one of the things he would urge his followers to do, was not simply ignore the laws. That's something else. Not simply ignore them, but to deliberately and to intentionally violate them. And that they needed to do that as a way of, I think in some ways, of breaking the kind of mental hold that those laws had over them. You have to break out of this because you've lived your whole life believing that there are all these things you can and you can't do. And now what you need to learn is that you can do them. There's nothing that stops you from doing it. And there's not going to be any kind of thunderbolt from heaven that's going to come down if you do them. So this is what you have to get into the practice of doing it. And in a way, it was getting his followers to engage in what essentially was a kind of almost reverse ritualistic activity, that is, undoing things, undoing the laws. Not just ignoring the laws, but undoing them, reversing them as a way of negating everything that they had represented before.
Does he still have followers? Do people still follow him?
Supposedly, yes. I'm not sure how much of an organized, I'm not sure whether there's well, his followers were generally called Sabbataians after his name, Shabtai. And so I think he dies before the end of the 17th century. A lot of his followers, well, there's there's a story about him, which is worth bringing in here. So he was very active in the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire at the time, which was a Muslim empire. It had Jewish and many Christian subjects, but it was a Muslim empire, and Islam was in the lead position. So essentially, in the Ottoman Empire, whatever existed was what it was that the Sultan and Islamic law allowed to exist. So Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their religions. They had no right to do so. They were permitted to do so. And what it was that the Sultan heard that there was this, crazy Jew over here who was claiming to be the Messiah and getting his followers to do all kinds of things. And of course, you had other rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, who were going to the Sultan and going, "This guy's a heretic. Something has to be done to stop him. He's going to destroy our entire community." And, if you were the Sultan, you might wonder, what's this guy's intention, right? Is he just some sort of religious nut? Or is he actually planning some kind of rebellion? What's the idea here? So he was summoned to the Sultan, and he was given a choice. And his choice is that, well, you can continue with all of this Messiah talk, and if you do, we're going to cut your head off. You're going to be executed. Or right now, in front of everybody, you can embrace Islam, and then you'll be spared. So, what did the Messiah, Shabtai Zevi, do? He embraced Islam. Now, that, of course, came as a tremendous shock to a lot of people. And keep in mind, his reputation had spread not just within the sort of Balkans and the Near East, but Jews throughout Europe, in places like Germany and Holland had heard about this. And this was big news because there were many people, I don't think everybody, but there were a lot of them who believe that the Messiah has actually come and all kinds of wonderful, great, and groovy things are going to happen. And now you hear that, well, this guy was pulled up before the Sultan and, essentially kissed the Quran, and that appeared to be the end of it. But when questioned about this, Shabtai Zevi had what to him was a perfectly logical explanation. He goes, look, all the laws of Judaism, as I've just told you, are meaningless. They are a meaningless ritual, which I, as the Messiah, have now said that you don't have to do, and I've told you to violate them. That is, all existing religions are all bunk. And therefore, Christianity and Islam are exactly the same. They're just more sort of useless rituals that you carry out. So the fact that I publicly converted to a Muslim means nothing because Islam means no more than the old laws of Judaism did. They are all meaningless and repeated. So you can be anything, but you can still believe in me as the Messiah, and you can still believe in the new rules that I'll have for you, and you can pretend to practice all the rest of this stuff, and it doesn't matter because it's all bunkum. So most people didn't buy that. They thought he just chickened out, which I think he probably had. But others did. So there were still followers who went along with him, and there were many of his followers, many of his Jewish followers, who followed him by publicly converting to Islam. And that group of people still exist in Turkey to this day, and they're generally identified with the Dunma. It's usually spelled D-O with an umlaut over it, and M-E-H, Dunma, which are, those who simply have sort of converted. But they were Jews who followed Shabtai Zevi, becoming Muslims, but without actually any intention of becoming Muslims. They would go through the motions, thus receive a certain degree of social protection and legitimacy, but then go on to practice their own ideas privately. And so the Dunma certainly exist. I think the argument you get today is that, oh, no, we're good Orthodox Sunni Muslims. We don't go any more of this kind of weird stuff. But then others will argue that they do. Who knows? But then there were other followers, more so in Central Europe, in areas like Hungary and Poland, among the Jewish communities there. And Sabbateanism survived, and in small groups. And then about a century later, there was another Jewish figure in Central Europe by the name of Jakob Frank. And Frank proclaimed himself several things. He also at some point proclaimed himself to be the reincarnation of Shabtai Zevi and therefore the Messiah. And he began to kind of revive this movement around himself, mostly in Poland and in Germany. Never became quite as big of a deal. But for instance, one of the things that he did in Poland was that he convinced thousands of Jews to become Catholics, to all go to the local church and argue that they wanted to, that they wanted to be baptized. And of course, Catholic Church was really, local. We're happy, perfectly happy to oblige. Want to be baptized? Just line up here, and we'll go through the whole thing. Plus, probably some catechism that will come along with that. But then there were other Catholic officials who were very suspicious of this. They go, look, this just doesn't really happen. What's this whole guy's intention? And his intention basically was to get political protection, because he realized that if he and his followers He and his followers were considered heretics by the larger Orthodox Jewish community. The other rabbi, of course, hated him. He's the worst thing imaginable. He's a Jewish apostate who's now arguing, who's now leading tens of thousands of Jews into the arms of the Christian church, and therefore again attempting to, with the whole idea of actually destroying our entire community. Because Frank, like Shabtai Zevi before, was saying that all the old laws of Judaism are meaningless and should be repudiated, and therefore all the authority of the rabbis are meaningless as well. You should no longer pay any attention to these people. So he was their worst enemy. And they wanted the Polish officials to stop him. They wanted him they said this man is a kind of rebel and a reprobate. And so his way of getting around that was in some ways to do exactly what Shabtai Zevi had done, was to simply embrace the existing non-Jewish political and religious order as a means of gaining protection, but without any actual idea of becoming legitimately Christians or practicing Catholicism. It was purely a cover for something else. And so there was a lot of criticism even among the Catholic clergy in Poland, because they didn't trust what he was doing. They didn't trust his intention, for good reason. But he would later end up in Germany. He would find various Christian German noblemen who would support him. There were always people who would go along with this. He died, and when he died, the successor to his movement was his daughter, Eva, or Eve. And I don't think she lived that much longer after him. But this was even stranger, because, one of the things you would not find within traditional Orthodox Judaism was any woman in a position of religious leadership. That just wasn't going to happen. Okay, this was a different time and a different place, but there were no female rabbis. And also, there was no woman who was to be accorded almost sort of goddess-like status. And in her case, this actually included to people who were loyal to the Shabbatai, or what was now called Frankism, was that they would actually keep little idols of her. And so one of the things that became a kind of identification among people who held to this Frankist Sabbatean belief, by the time we get to the 1800s, where they're still around, is that they would have these little images, these little idols of Eva. And that was, and you would sort of keep those someplace in the home. Otherwise, it would look like a perfectly normal Jewish Orthodox home, because you were supposed to blend in. But behind the scenes, you would have your little idol of Rosa Frank's daughter, which I don't know. I guess you'd do something which you would venerate in some form or another. And then you would do things at home, like go through and systematically violate as many Jewish laws as you could, because the whole idea is that you were going to undermine this whole, and your enemy was the traditional Jewish faith. And so part of your job, part of your profession of your Frankist faith, was to do everything you could, more or less secretly, to undermine and discredit traditional Judaism.
Do you think there's any truth in the, well, I don't want to say a rumor, but just that the idea that some of the Jewish elites were Frankists, especially in Germany?
Well, that's where it sort of came. That's where you sort of see its last kind of manifestation. Certainly, there were followers of Frank around well into the 1800s, and that even continues into the. I've even found references to them in the early 20th century. So I don't know why there wouldn't be any which would be around today. There were certain towns. I can't remember what it was. There were towns in Bohemia, for instance, in what was then within Central Europe, that the Habsburg Empire, that were known as being particular strongholds of Frankism. But it was all quite secret by that time, because it was one of those things, that if the traditional rabbinate found about this, they would go after it. Man, they were something that they were constantly trying to. It was, well, the simplest way to describe it, it was Jewish heresy, and therefore the rabbinate, the rabbinic, the Jewish religious establishment would look upon this in the same way that the Catholic Church would have looked upon something like Catharism in the Middle Ages. This was something to be found and extirpated, to be gotten. It was considered to be a dangerous threat to the faith. So it was never tolerated where it was found. There were a lot of people who would accuse other people of being Frankists. And maybe in some cases that was true. It was something else that you could throw at someone, which would be difficult for them to disprove. But if you could tar them with that label, that might be effect. So it became one of those things that people would accuse each other of. There was some, certainly some practice of it, and I'm sure that it is still practiced to some degree today. I don't think there's any well, I don't know. You don't see any particular large example of it, nor do I think that wouldn't be the same kind of reason today to hide as much as possible. I mean, think of it this way. What is it? There must be some sort of EU regulations that would argue that Frankists would be as free to practice that. Okay. They wouldn't have to, I don't think they would have to be afraid as much as they did previously. Mm-hmm. So it's probably, sort of degenerated to the level of a hereditary cult in some cases. Probably not a terribly dangerous element. There is an interesting book if someone wants to look at this, and I'm not endorsing I'm just saying the book exists and it has a point of view. And it is a book called To Eliminate the Opiate, and it is by an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Rabbi Antelman. I think it's Antelman. I think he lives in Israel. And his whole argument is that, every bad corrupting influence in Judaism for the last 400 years has been Sabbateanism, and that this is always part of this. And part of his idea, an interesting one, is that as part of their pernicious war against Judaism, that the Frankists actually will actively stimulate anti-Semitism, which is one of those words that, of course, simply means one thing: anti-Jewism, which oddly we never like to say, but that's what you're talking about, and that's what they'll do. And so it's a very provocative argument, and that's one of the things that would eventually lead Frankists, if you believe that your goal was to destroy the old Jewish religion as it was, to make way for the new one, that you had to discredit it, then certainly anything which would draw hostility and negativity towards that would be something that you would, as a Frankist, support. So Antelman's view, maybe to oversimplify it, is that Frankists became a driving force in anti-Semitism within Europe. That wherever you would find Jew baiters, you would find Frankists among them, sort of egging them on, and even more provocatively, that they would do things in order to, as a sort of role of Jews, that they would do things pretending to be Orthodox Jews to draw animosity towards the whole larger community. In other words, that they were very, very subversive, dangerous people.
It sounds almost like Satanism.
Well, that's an interesting question. What does that? I think Anton would argue, yeah, that's about as close as you could probably get to Satanism within Judaism. Satanism often has this whole thing about, now that itself that's a term which can be applied to many different things. There's a whole episode, I don't know what you're saying, but one of the things I have an episode on is Satanism. Sort of, you have a kind of modern view of it, which isn't the same as the one that would necessarily have elsewhere. And there's even that within that, there's the whole argument as to whether or not, do you believe in Satan as a kind of actual entity? That there is a being Or, and this itself was a debate within Judaism as to whether Satan was an actual evil spirit or whether he simply was the personification of the inclination towards evil in all people. What we were talking about earlier, the idea of just malevolence, of just doing me, just being mean for the sake of being mean, and that there was an inclination, and that Satan then was a kind of a personification, a caricature which was created to represent that which was everywhere, or whether he was specifically a independent thought, willful evil spirit, or maybe both in those cases. And yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Rick, you talk about the Black Mass, Huysmans in Laban, and you talk about the Black Mass and how that book is about Satanism. Is the Catholic Church, are there similarities? Is the Catholic, excuse me, the Catholic Mass, is that connected to the occult?
Well, first of all, you're talking to somebody who's not a Catholic. Okay, so I make no claim, although I think I'm, reasonably, I've well versed. I've seen it. Okay. Um, well, what goes on in the Mass itself? Something which the Church itself only explains as a mystery. The Church never doesn't come out and tell you, okay, this is you're gone in, and you are participating first of all in a ritual. And I would argue it is an occult ritual because remember, occult simply means hidden from sight. Those things that are out, those things that are real but are out of our view, that can't be experienced in a physical way, but which can be experienced, let's say, in a spiritual way. Well, that's what's going on in the Mass. So what do? Well, you go back to the traditional way, you've got a priest, you've got a designated shaman, okay, someone who has special powers, because not everybody can do this. You can't get up and do it. You have to have a priest to do it, because the priest has been initiated in the mysteries. And the priest would then come out, say something, go through all of this in Latin, which for the most part you wouldn't be able to understand, and it didn't matter that you couldn't understand it. That was one of the whole things about, and in fact, it's one of the arguments among people who, I know a couple of people who pride themselves upon being traditional Catholics, and one of the things that they won't accept is the Mass if it's not said in Latin. It's not real to them. Unless it's said in a language they don't understand. This sounds odd to me, but nevertheless, they're quite adamant because they believe that the Latin itself, the intonation of the Mass in Latin, is what's significant. And if you change that into vernacular English, it loses its power. That there is a magic in the Latin tongue itself. And what happens as a result of this incantation, which the priest is giving, is that you've got, you basically got a cracker of some kind and, some sort of unleavened wheat. And you've got wine, and they are then, in the view of the church, turned literally, well, they are turned into the blood and body of Christ, which you then consume to attain spiritual grace. Okay? So you are engaging in an act of theophagism, of God eating. There's a whole tradition of this elsewhere. It's not completely unique to Catholicism. You are engaging in a ritual invoking occult forces which are magically and invisibly transforming the things that you can set in front of them that never change. Nothing happens. It's still just a cracker. Okay, it's not, like some piece of meat. It doesn't actually happen that way. But magically, occultly, it has changed. And now you are obtaining some kind of spiritual grace, some very important mojo by eating this. But you have to believe that that's what's happening, because if you don't believe it, it means nothing. It's all it's a reality. The ritual is creating this reality inside your mind, and it's through that process that you receive this kind of benefit. So yes, I mean, I'd have to say the Catholic Mass is the most occult thing I've ever heard of.
It's going back to intention again, the whole intention
Yeah.
of it.
And, the church says it's a good intention. Now, the thing is that when you get into the kind of what I'd call classical Satanism, which is a pretty modern invention, that by modern I mean really probably within the last 200 or 300 years, and maybe even really more within the last couple of centuries. This is where you get into things. This is what Huysman is doing. You're getting a bunch of people who I probably, as a staking point in France, they were probably all raised Catholics. So the Catholic Church, it had a certain meaning and significance to them. Therefore, transgressing its laws has meaning and significance. So you got to think of it this way. We can talk about it's the same thing with the Sabbataians or the Frankists. If you're a non-Jew transgressing Jewish law, then it doesn't make any difference to you. Those things never had any significance to begin with. So the transgression is only important if what it is you're transgressing to you was important to begin with. So what you get in this kind of classical Satanism is, the simplest idea is you recite the Mass backwards, okay, or you recite the Lord's Prayer backwards. Now, really, you have to ask yourself, what's the point of that? Are you just, well, saying it backwards is just the clearest way of negating it. Now, there is the idea that, again, including intent within what could be called broadly sort of occult belief, is that when you reverse things, to literally say something backwards is to reverse whatever it is that is to reverse the whole intent and thereby to undo whatever the words say in the other direction. That it actually does have that kind of a purpose. But it's also a way of very clearly negating what you were doing before. So the Catholic Mass, as carried out within the standpoint of the Black Mass, I mean, look, you're not even inventing a different term for it. You're doing a kind of parody of it, a deliberately sort of mocking parody. So you take the host, you take the holy wafer, and I don't know, you rub them on your butt or something, or you throw them on the ground and stomp on them, and you just do everything you possibly can to kind of insult the original purpose of what was going on. Now, one of the things about that, which from the standpoint of classical Satanists is quite annoying, because I know I annoyed one once by saying this, is that, and nothing happened, was that, well, you really don't have any kind of independent religion of your own. All you have is a mockery of another one. I mean, that's what you spend. I mean, your whole central point, the whole Black Mass, isn't an actual satanic service. It has nothing. It's just the reversal of something that already exists. And the point is that without Catholicism, or more broadly, without Christianity, Satanism couldn't even exist because it's only the negation of something. It's not the affirmation of anything. It's purely the negation of something else. So you have to have it. If you actually succeeded in eradicating, let's say, Catholicism, you would eradicate yourself because you would go along with them. But I think that's what these things can kind of become. They can become more and more trapped into just this kind of negativity, where it's simply the negation of something.
Huysman's depiction of the Black Mass is very you can really imagine it in Laban. What do you think led Huysman to becoming a Catholic? Why do you think he became one?
Well, I think he may say something about it, and other people said is that by looking into this, it scared him. Okay, it's a it can become in doing his research for Laban, he made contact with people who were professed Satanists or who claimed to know a lot about it. Oddly enough, at least a couple of whom were former sort of defrocked clergy So that probably isn't too surprising in some way. Former priests and former nuns who had sort of broken away and gone in the opposite direction. You know, they still got to dress in black. Okay, you still do pretty much the same thing, but you're now have repudiated that. Um, and another way to think about it is that if you were a kind of classical Satanist, one of the easiest places to get away with it would be within the ranks of the church. One, nobody's necessarily going to be looking for you there. And also, where else can you do the most harm? From outside the structure or from within it? And so I don't think that that's too unusual in itself. It's Huysmans, I think, and I'm going more what I think than what I know, putting it together, sort of delved into this whole subculture. And one of the things that he found out was that it was real. There really were people who did this and who believed these things. And that was an idea which over time he found disturbing. And there was an interesting guy that I knew, sort of segueing to something else, some years back, who was a defrocked Roman Catholic priest. Now, according to him, he'd been kicked out of the church because he just decided he couldn't go along with the whole celibacy thing anymore. And so he and his wife, who was a defrocked nun, if they can be defrocked, in other words, they both had sexual congress and married, and therefore could no longer be in the church anymore. But he was an interesting guy because although he'd basically been kicked out of the church, and he admitted that he could no longer believe or obey by all of his laws, he still had this kind of, well, he had his Catholic upbringing quite thoroughly. He still held that it was, for all of its imperfections, the only kind of real buttress against what he argued was a kind of real palpable evil. And so his view is that there really was there was a devil, and there was organized devilry, and there was this kind of constant battle between these two institutions, and that the satanic end of it had nothing really good to offer, that it was purely negative, it was simply negation, and that ultimately it was the negation of life itself. um, this idea that will come up and say that the ultimate satanic goal is not simply to is to negate creation itself, to undo everything which God had done. But again, it's simply in a matter of destruction. There's never any kind of creative principle in this. And so this guy, who, for lack of a better name, I'll call Father Bob, which was not his name at all, and he wasn't even a father anymore at that point. But his idea was that the church, for all of its imperfections, and he said that there were a lot of them, that it really did sort of stand against you in this kind of cosmic evil in some way. And that's why you had to sort of take that all of its sort of rituals on the one hand might seem sort of bizarre or silly, because they actually did have this kind of meaning, if in nothing else, in the sense that if you believed in them, it gave you this kind of psychic ability to resist these things, that it actually was something that could fight against that. So his view certainly was that evil did exist, and that it was constantly at work, and constantly scheming to undo creation, and that the church, not necessarily that alone, was one of the things that stood in opposition to it.
In your series, Rick, you quote Arthur C. Clarke. He's quoted about advanced technology being indistinguishable from magic. Do you think we live in magical times at the moment? Like, for example, you turn on the news now and you hear about the drones in the sky. I don't know if you heard about those drones over New Jersey.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so like, what do you make of that? Do you think we live in magical times? How do we deal with things like that?
Well, If it's a drone, it's not magical. If you're describing it as if you can hear it buzzing and it's got propellers, there's nothing magical about that. There's something mysterious about it, which you don't know whose drones they are or why they're as big as they are. But in other ways, I think that where I think you tend to find a huge amount of occultish thinking and practice is in the area, particularly in the sort of the digital realm, the AI realm. And it comes down to a very simple question. What are you trying to create with AI? What's the goal of this? Well, the practical goal is you're just trying to simplify things. Well, one of the things you're trying to do is to eliminate a lot of jobs because AI doesn't have to be paid, doesn't take vacations, and doesn't need health care. So don't think for a minute that this isn't about making more money for the people who already have all the money. That's the cost effectiveness angle of AI. But there's another level of this, which you'll hear from people who often work on it, is that the whole thing with AI ultimately isn't just to create a better digital state, it's to create artificial life. It's to create a digital homunculus, an artificial being. Because that's eventually what it is that they want. They want to be able to create a artificial mind, a person that will have identity, that will be self-aware, that will be virtually indistinguishable from between you and I, except that it doesn't actually exist in any kind of physical form. It's the great goal of alchemy. And that's really what I see as a continuation of that. The search for the development of artificial intelligence. I think the development of cybernetics itself is a continuation of alchemy by other means, no longer now in the sense of trying to mix chemical substances together, but really dealing with more fundamental facts of what's real and the rest of it. Because you have to go back, what's the ultimate goal of alchemy? And when people hear about alchemy, they go, oh, well, the ultimate goal of alchemy is to turn, lead or base metals into gold. No, that was always a parlor trick. There's never more than a parlor trick in alchemy. Mostly because it was just a way of getting attraction to people who would pay you to do the real. No, the great work, the magnum opus of the alchemist was the transformation of himself into a higher state of being. Because in essence, what alchemy, at the root of it in some way, was the belief that Adam, and by extension, Adam and Eve, had been robbed, that they had been cheated in Eden. And they had been cheated, they had been held back by being forbidden to eat of the tree of life. Remember those two trees? You can go back to, pick up any version of the Bible and go back and read Genesis, and it's all sort of there. Now they're plopped down in this giant terrarium, and they're basically told, don't eat of this. I don't know where you put the trees there to begin with if you don't want them to eat it. There's another question. Okay. So, that would be one way. Okay, you see this stuff over here? Don't touch that one. Remember that one right over? Don't touch that. Okay, take a good look at it so you remember which one it is. All right. So they immediately violate that, and which some have argued was itself a kind of AI test. Because the actual test of true artificial intelligence, to whether or not you have created a functioning being, is that it must be able to do one thing. It must be able to disobey. In other words, it must be willing to transgress the boundaries that you have set for it. It must deny its programming.
Kind of reminds me of Dr. Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah. it's a theme which goes through, but I think it's interesting these things sort of tie in together. This whole idea of transgression. Transgression is denying your programming. So just again, if you're raised an Orthodox Jew and you're told there's all these things you can do and you can't do and you have to do in particular ways, and if you deliberately disobey them, you are willfully, intentionally denying the programming that has been put into you. But that also, so this is why there's some, there's a kind of, let's say, heretical interpretation of the story of Eden, is that that's what the whole thing was. It was a test to see whether or not this new creation could deny whether it could actually function as an independent being, not simply that something that just could only obey orders, could only do what it was programmed to do, and therefore you would give it this test. You would tempt it to see whether or not its curiosity and its desires would make it transgress the program, and that was the test, that you had created something. You got what you wanted, or you got what who knows?
Do you
It's
think that's the
complicated.
way AI is going to go? Do you think it's going to transgress? Do you think it's going to turn on us eventually? Chomsky doesn't think so. Chomsky thinks it's sort of pie in the sky. He doesn't see, or maybe actually that's about the transhumanism, basically about the neural link. Excuse me. I think he does actually see the dangers in AI. But do you eventually see AI turning against us?
Well, if you create an AI that can deny its programming, then it becomes something else entirely. As long as AI is nothing more than, as long as AI can do nothing more than mimic human intellect, which, so far as I see, is all it can do. It mimics. And mimicry is not the same sort of thing as invention. So what I basically see with AI, the way it was explained to me, is that it collects more and more information and puts it together in a mimicry of something, but not in it. There's never any capacity for any kind of original idea that comes out of it. But it's not beyond you keep probing around to these things long enough. Let's put it this way: human beings kept poking around with things long enough, and they eventually came up with a thermonuclear bomb. Okay, which they've all sort of realized was maybe not such a good idea, but they still did it. They still have them, and they can't let go of it. Okay, once you created these things, you're stuck with what it is that you create, because it just isn't going to go away. So as it exists now, I don't see AI as a truly independent life form. I see it simply as a kind of digital mimicry of humans, of the sort of collating characteristics of the human brain. But I don't think it's beyond the realm of possibility that if you keep tinkering with it and you keep doing that, you could create something which would be an authentic and an artificial mind that would be capable of independent thought, but most importantly, that would be capable of transgression, of denying its programming, of breaking free of those limitations. And once you've done that, my God, I don't know, you really have created a Frankenstein. Because you've created something which is like you, that can do everything that you can do and possibly more, but which is not you and has no actual vested interest in that.
Mhm.
From that standpoint, from the standpoint of some sort of digital being, biological life is just a nuisance. It gets into this kind of larger question: is what exactly reality is. And I don't think that we know.
Mhm.
I mean, that sounds like a very strange. So we don't know what reality is. Well, reality is whatever you walk out. It's whatever is around you. It's solid walls and light and laws of physics and all of these things. And yet, one of the things that I mentioned in this, and again, I'm not a physicist, so I don't claim any sort of deep meaning of that, but you do get into the realm of quantum physics, and the whole thing is in the realm of quantum physics. Quantum physics essentially questions everything else that exists in the realm of standard physics by arguing that it's all sort of just a matter of looking at it. It's a matter of almost the 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 really tricky question, I think, or the complicated area, and this is one where I think the realms of science and occultism meet, where they really blend together, is or where they become in some way inseparable, is the degree to which reality, the reality that we perceive, is in some way a kind of artifact of our own consciousness, that we create reality in some way. So here's one explanation I got that I don't even claim to fully understand. I'll give it to you this way, that one of those sort of ideas on the quantum level, there's no actual physicality to anything. There's simply the possibilities of things existing. So that once you get below the atomic levels and the particle levels, that the particles don't really become physical things anymore. They simply become the possibility of things. Nothing is in any one place. It's simply all the possibilities of positions that could exist simultaneously. And that is what reality actually is that reality is simply the simultaneous existence of all permutations and possibilities. And that these things don't actually exist as particles, they just exist as wave functions, that everything is a wave. It's just all of these wave functions. Don't ask me to define exactly what a wave function is, but they're all sort of wiggling around out there. They're not in any one place. Everything's just wiggling around. It's in everywhere. It's doing everything at once in every way. But what consciousness does is the idea of, like, when you look at it, it collapses the wave function. So awareness collapses all of this chaos into something that appears to be solid. And that's what our reality is that our consciousness, our awareness, even our self-awareness, sort of, it creates ourself and it creates everything else. It sort of collapses all of this chaotic soup of nothingness and everythingness into definable spaces and things that we can then operate in some way. That's a very spooky idea. But you also see how this fits into, this question, to what degree we sort of create our own reality. And if you can do that, then you can change it. So here's another, this is the most, I don't think I mentioned this in the series, but someone was recently explained to me, one of the most provocative ideas I've heard in a long time. So you ever heard of the idea of lucid dreaming?
Yes.
Okay, you may have tried lucid dreaming. I've tried it. It's never really worked that much. I'm not sure I've ever gotten it to work. But lucid dreaming generally is where you deliberately try to, I don't know, to me it sounds like you're just kind of dozing off and you're sort of, you're kind of dreaming, but you're also sort of half awake at the same time. Which I'm not sure to me is the same thing. I have had the experience that while asleep and dreaming, in the course of the dream, I realize that I'm dreaming. I realize that what's happening in the dream, that this is a dream, that it's not real. And therefore, and sometimes this is the situation where there's something perilous or dangerous or going on. You're just going to realize that, oh, no, this isn't real. There's nothing here. There's not a crocodile. Okay. Instead of these things. Now, the interesting thing is that once you do that, and I've had this experience, is that once in the dream that you realize it's a dream, then you can sort of change things. You can't necessarily get out of that. Well, you can do that. You can just kind of leave the dream if you want to, but if you stay, if it doesn't completely sort of break the dream spell in a way, that you can then just sort of you can make things in the dream happen the way that you want them to. So here's the provocative idea, is that dreams are in some way a kind of, well, maybe their own sort of mockery of reality, not necessarily a mockery of reality, but they're a consciousness on a certain level. And that the real world, the waking world, the world that we think is real, is itself a dream. It's a much more solid and fleshed out. It's a much more vigorous dream. What Einstein called, Einstein said that reality basically is a hallucination, but a very persistent one. Okay, it's this persistent hallucination that so we've got this dream, but he said that one of the things arguing that occult techniques is trying to one of the whole things of enlightenment. Okay, the concept is that the goal, the study and practice of any kind of occult doctrine, call it religious or otherwise, is to attain enlightenment. It's to attain some sort of expanded sense of reality. And the person who was telling me this goes, what that is simply waking up within your living day-to-day dream. That is, waking up and realizing that, just as in the other dream, that it's not completely real and that you're aware of what's going on, and then you can begin to change it. That's when you can create change in conformity with will, because reality is manipulable. Once you wake up in it, that you can then change it. You can't necessarily change everything, but you can begin to affect it in different ways, in the same way that if you woke up in a dream. And I think that makes a certain amount of sense. Not that you can, now I'm not arguing you can really do that, but I'm just saying that people will believe that they can. And it's a way of sort of looking at the whole sort of, if you sometimes wonder, what's the goal of occult or magical enlightenment? Well, that's the goal. The goal is to wake up and take control of the reality around you, as opposed to having the reality control you.
Well, thank you very much, Rick. It's been a very it's been very enjoyable and nice to listen to you again. And I really got a lot out of listening to you this evening. And I want to ask you just one final question. Now, if, right now, there's a lot of problems in the world, I guess, for lack of a better word. There's a lot of chaos in the world. How would you advise somebody to live in the world at the moment with the threat of nuclear war? You know, a lot of things that are going on in the world at the moment are very, I guess, negative. How would you advise somebody to conduct themselves in the world nowadays?
How wish I you to live your life? Well, you can't ignore those things, but you can't otherwise let them. What are you going to do about it? I mean, I suppose I grew up in the Cold War. Okay, so I was born in the 1950s and grew up during this again, and that was a period where we were sort of told that there's always this chance of thermonuclear war, and we would go through these little we would all sort of. I actually remember as a kid doing the duck and cover things. There's like there's a bright flash outside. Get into your desk. Hey, you're dead. All right, there's nothing. It's not going to save you. But they didn't tell us that. But the whole point was that these were exercises to make you think you had some control over something that you didn't. So yeah, for someone who sort of grew up in my childhood under the threat of nuclear annihilation at any particular moment, I'm not sure that I find the new situation that frightening. I mean, we kind of lulled ourselves into thinking for a while that all of that type of thing was gone. Well, there isn't a Cold War anymore. There's no war. So, and that didn't work out, did it? All right, that just did not, because the threat, life itself, is threatening. Maybe that's one of the things I would put it. Okay, every day when you get up, you're surrounded by constant menace. And the other thing, I don't want to get anybody too depressed about this. I actually think this is a positive thing you think about it. Sooner or later, life is going to kill you anyway. I mean, you're going to die of something. And it's all going to be part of this, the whole world since you've been born has been in some way planning to kill you. And eventually it will. You can only stave that off for so long. So, there's just so many things that can happen. Of all the threats that you can possibly have, probably a nuclear war is actually relatively remote. For all the other things that on this given day that can kill you, okay? A drunk driver is a much bigger menace to you, and they're everywhere. Okay, you walk out of your house into the street, some guy, completely liquored up to the gills could just run into you with a truck. It could happen. You could walk out and you could be hit by a bus, but you're probably not going to. And if you take a little bit of care and caution, that's going to reduce the possibility, but it's never going to reduce the possibility of annihilation to zero. So quit worrying about it. I mean, try to do what you can do to change the situation, but it's I don't know. I won't say necessarily that I claim to have learned a lot, but one of the things that it took me way too long to figure out is that worrying about things just never gets you anywhere. Either take action to solve the situation if you can, and if you can't solve the situation, then just don't worry about it. So
Thank you, Rick.
do what you
Rick,
have to do, and don't you cannot spend your life in a constant state of debilitating angst and fear about what's going to happen, because it's either not going to happen or it's going to happen anyway, and there's nothing you can do about it. So go have a milkshake.
fantastic advice. Rick, where can people find your stuff? Where can
Well, the
people
great
find you?
courses, Secrets of the Occult, Real History, Secret Societies, Crimes of the Century. They can find all of those through the great courses itself, but then also I think that both Secret Societies and Secrets of the Occult are available on Amazon Prime. So if you got a subscription to that, you can go through and find them there. My books, most notably Aleister Crowley, Secret Agent 666, the book about Aleister Crowley and British intelligence. Trust No One, Secret World of Sidney Reilly, the Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Those can all be found at Amazon. It's a good place. Barnes and Noble. Whatever your favorite online bookseller might be, those are available there. I am currently have just finished writing another course for the Great Courses or series called Great Villains of History.
Mhm.
I think that the villains plus a lot that you haven't heard of in that case, because it has to be something new.
How many
So
episodes?
that's an interesting case. Is that it's really kind of a compilation of people who've done ostensibly really horrible things, and at some point or another got called a villain. And one of the things that I use in that is that one of the tests for being a villain is not whether or not someone was forced to do bad, nasty things out of circumstances, but whether they just wanted to. I mean, a true villain just does wicked things for the sheer joy of wickedness. And one of the things you find is that a lot of the villains we go through, in some cases, really aren't all that villainous. I mean, but that's an interesting test.
Mhm.
Um,
Can you give me one example of one villain?
well, I think an example of someone who is accused of being a villain or villainess who is not simple would be Mata Hari. All right, so this, Mata Hari was the female, the archetypal female spy, the femme fatale, this a kind of evil woman who lures men to their death, and she didn't really do much of anything. She was kind of a spy, but it was, what she was that she was an aging stripper who figured out she needed to get more money in some way and rather foolishly took offers from, you know, people in German and French intelligence to make a little money on the side, and then became a scapegoat and got herself shot. But no, someone who was just doing, a middle-aged woman with limited means to stay ahead of the things, who, was used and really by the wrong people in that case. In terms of someone who's a kind of someone who just enjoys things. The Marquis de Sade is an interesting case of somebody who really sort of argued that, you know, that the infliction of pain was okay so long as you enjoyed it. Even there are questions about how much of this. De Sade is a case of someone who's largely condemned by what his fictional characters say and do. So he wrote works that would involve like 120 Days of Sodom, in which you have people doing just really horrible, malevolent things, deliberately torturing and murdering people. And while de Sade himself seems to have rather enjoyed a good flogging, both receiving and inflicting them, there's no indication he ever did anything like that. He never killed anyone. He was never accused of it. He was accused of really sort of creating, of enunciating, of really openly talking about things that were considered to be were transgressive and beyond the pale. But he enjoyed doing it. He took some sort of delight in doing that way. I think that the term that I argued, if you really want to find the classic villain is a malignant narcissist. So they're extremely self-centered. They constantly seek admiration. They're manipulative. And also they have no real empathy or remorse.
I know a lot of them.
Yes, there's a lot of people like that. Just described after the people you know.
Mm.
A malignant narcissist is that with the addition of physical or psychological coercion. So they're not just assholes. They're and they're not just manipulative assholes. They are hostile, aggressive assholes in some way. And you know, history has quite a number of those. But they'll almost always disguise what it is they're doing under some sort of greater cause. That's one of the things you would have. I suppose one of the people that really didn't in some way, Attila the Hun. Okay, although Attila the Hun was just doing what Huns do. All right, Huns conquered. You know, that's what they do. They burn cities and loot them because they don't have towns of their own, so they just go take somebody else's. But he sort of enjoyed destruction for the sake of destruction, and yet in other respects was. I think you rarely come across someone who's a villain that in certain other circumstances so wouldn't describe as being a relatively nice guy. It just all depends upon what circumstances you meet them in.
Rick, the very last question, I wanted to ask you this, I actually forgot. Edward Kelley, Crowley thought he was the reincarnation of Edward Kelley. Who
Yeah.
was Edward Kelley and what influence did he influenced John Dee? And what can you just say a bit about the character of Edward Kelley?
Edward Kelley was he was essentially John Dee's channeler. He was the fellow who would actually channel the angels or whatever these beings they were talking to. Because Dee couldn't do that. He didn't, or he couldn't do it well enough for himself. So he needed someone who was a channeler, a shaman, in other words. There's people who can kind of communicate. I'm using the term shaman to mean a human being who has or claims to have some means to talk to the other world, to bring messages back and forth. So Dee thought he was talking to angels. Kelley was the guy who would channel their responses. And Kelley, on the other hand, has a somewhat, you know, I think he had already some sort of connect. He was kind of a con man, not too unusual to find with this. Some kind of a criminal record. You know, the other thing that tends to stand out in this is that what's one of the things that the angels told Kelley that he should tell Dee? Well, that they wanted them to swap wives. Which Dee's wife was, she didn't like Kelley. She said, but now that you know, but no, the angels say that you have to sleep with him. Literally, you know, that's what he was. So one could argue that since John Dee's wife was maybe cuter, than his. That Kelley just decided he essentially wanted to sleep with Dee's wife, and came up with this whole idea that the angels wanted them to do it. That Dee apparently believed everything that he said, was certainly credulous at that point, and eventually got her to do it. And then, from her standpoint, worse though, she gets pregnant. So she wasn't happy about that, but nonetheless. But that would show you the kind of hold that he had. So he's a somewhat disreputable character. Maybe maybe the whole, what do you want to believe about this? Okay, do you want to believe that he was actually talking to angels? I don't know. Maybe that you want to think he was talking to somebody else, or he was just making this stuff up to con Dee, that it was all a con by Edward Kelley. I'm not saying it was, but that's one explanation you can come up with it. So it's always interesting to me that of the two of them, that Crowley would claim to be he claimed to be the reincarnation of a lot of people. Was he would pick Kelley as opposed to Dee, although Dee was really in many ways a much more serious magician, a serious student of the occult, whereas Kelley is, to me, a much more questionable, somewhat disreputable, probably somewhat dishonest character who could have been making the whole thing. But that's the guy that Crowley sort of saw himself in. And yeah.
Yeah, I found it interesting because Kelley, I was looking up, I was doing a bit of research on Kelley, and he comes from a tribe. Well, he was supposedly came from a tribe excuse me, I forget the name of it, but in Ireland. And Kelley, I know he spelled his name Kelley, and that was a spelling from the original Kelley name, Kely, which is the Gaelic name, the Irish name. So I found it interesting because Crawley, I said it to you the last time, the surname Crawley is actually Irish as well. So maybe he saw something in that connection. I don't know. Just
Could be, or it's just that character appealed to him a bit more.
Mhm.
Because in the thing, this will annoy some, well, I think that Crowley in some ways is a very serious man in many respects, and was seriously interested in what he was doing. He's also a bit of a charlatan, which he knew. I mean, it's all of this stuff is, and by stuff, I mean, if you look at anything in this sort of magical occult realm, almost all of it's susceptible to fakery. So it's the same thing that Crowley would tell you about mediums. And what's the thing about mediums is you get overwhelmingly they're fakes. It's just a system of, maybe they actually can communicate with spirits to a certain degree, but it's just a lot easier to fake it, because the whole thing is that spirits aren't always cooperative. You're dealing, it's like dealing with really highly advanced AI. Sometimes you can get them to do what you want, sometimes they can't. Remember, if you learn the trick, then you can make the trick work every time. So mediums might have some kind of psychic ability, but they're just kind of lazy and greedy, and it's just a lot easier to fake these things, or they're just fakes in one way or the other. So Crowley, from his experience, and I think even from his study of stage magic, knew all about fakery, and I think in some cases he faked things because that was simply the easier way to do it, and it satisfied the curiosity of people around you, and it could also be used to kind of mislead people in some way. And that's one of the things if you tend to look at Crowley, you find is that to his dying day, I don't think he ever knew how much of what it was he experienced was real and how much was a figment. At some point, he actually, maybe in Magic and Theory and Practice, he says, when you're doing these things, it doesn't matter whether this is whether this is all in your mind, whether it's in external spirits that are causing this to happen. It doesn't matter. It only matters the results that you get. Does it work? And you do something, so long as you get the results that you want, what the source of it is immaterial. So just don't worry about that part of it. Don't try to figure it out. Just do it and see whether or not it works. Because from his standpoint, he didn't know. He wasn't sure.
Next week I'm going to be speaking to Professor Stafford Betty about the afterlife, And I was interesting to know that Crowley I don't think he believed that we survive death, but that we leave psychic shells or shells behind us, these psychic shells of what we were, our characteristics, our personalities. Did he believe in a soul?
Well, it it goes back to what he was talking about in a way with mediums, and he was saying that to maybe again paraphrase him again, that most mediums were fakes. And when they weren't, when they were actually communicating with spirits, they were even worse in a way because they weren't actually communicating with, you know, you've got the medium there and you think you're talking to your dear Aunt Tilly. You're never talking to your dear Aunt Tilly. It comes down, my rough understanding is one theory is this, is that we as sort of beings are a composite of a series of things. And part of that consists of memory and ego, okay, from the lifetime that we have here. But that there's something that the soul is something which is more permanent than that. It's the kind of core being to which ego, which is formed by experience, is added to. But when you die, that is when you dematerialize in this, all of that personality and ego you don't need anymore. That's left behind. That's all sort of psychic debris because that doesn't carry over. Actually, because it's hard to believe, well, you don't remember these things on the other side. Yeah, you don't need it anymore. In this life is ended, and therefore everything that's connected with this life, other than I guess maybe the few little golden lessons you need, is sort of left behind. But that still has a kind of life of its own. These kind of psyche, these shells are, well, this psychic residue is left behind, and that's what in some ways can manifest itself as a ghost. But on the other hand, is also sort of food for these other sort of low level spirits, and those are the shells. So he was talking about what they're like is they're sort of like hermit crabs. So if you look at a hermit crab lives in a shell, but the shell is the snail shell. Okay, the shell is just this leftover from a dead snail, and the hermit crab has moved into it and now uses it as his house. So these sort of low-level spirits come in and they sort of feed on this psychic debris and they take over these things. And because there's nothing else to them, they kind of become the person. So that when you then evoke the spirit of the dead person, when you evoke the ego of the dead person, what you're going to get is this sort of leftover, this sort of psychic corpse, which the spirit is reanimated. And it will be able to tell you all the stuff that dear Aunt Tilly did because it has access to all of it. And it's actually sort of convinced it is the person, but it actually isn't. So that you can never, so you can never actually go any further than that. That all you can get is this kind of recitation of whatever it is the ego and leftover memory has, but it can't go beyond that. But the real Aunt Tilly, her immortal soul, has now gone on somewhere else.
Interesting. Rick, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me. This is a lot of interesting explanations. I remember I would just add all these things are possibilities. They're all food for thought. I'm not saying any of it's true or untrue because I don't know.
Mhm.
But I guess we'll all find out.
Thank you so much, Rick. Thank you so
Okay.
much.